Hello and welcome to what will hopefully be the first of many poetry events with Radical Art Review. Welcome and thanks to all of our subscribers and all of our Patreon supporters. Just to introduce us, Radical Art Review is a platform for art, culture and radical politics. We publish a biannual print issue and weekly digital content. We're volunteer-led and feature artists from around the world who use creativity as a means of defiance. So I'm Jessie Jones, I'm one of the literature editors here. I'm joined by the wonderful Kayo Chingonyi, who's graciously agreed to do a little reading for us and be interviewed. So I'm going to give you a little or large introduction now with all your accolades in it. So Kayo Chingonyi is the poet and author of the brand new collection, A Blood Condition, as well as his debut collection, Kumukanda, which won the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Somerset Maugham Award. He's also the author of two pamphlets, Sunbright Elegance and The Colour of James Brown's Scream. He's a fellow of the Complete Works programme for Diversity and Quality in British Poetry, and he's the poetry editor for the White Review, an assistant professor of creative writing at Durham University, and an MC, producer and DJ. Woof, loads of good stuff. So predominantly we're here today to discuss the forthcoming collection, A Blood Condition, which is published on the 22nd of April. And I'd be doing a great disservice though to that list of accolades if we didn't talk a little bit about at least most of them. So first of all, hello. Hi. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on. No. So firstly, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how lockdown has affected your creativity. I know that this was a collection that you were working on before all of this kicked off in full force, but I've spoken to some people who said that it's really spurred them on. It's given them time to do things that they normally wouldn't have had time to do, and other people who've said it's been just instant writer's block and an instant creativity block. So how have you found it?
I think it was kind of difficult initially to get into the frame of mind to make new work, just because I was overwhelmed by everything that was happening, and I still am, to be honest. But at a certain point, creativity became a kind of saving grace, I guess. Something to occupy the mind and channel the energy, I guess, at a time when those usual channels were curtailed. Like I would usually, I like to go and watch DJs or live music or loads of things that I normally do were maybe going into my creativity a little bit. So yeah, it was really hard actually initially, but yeah, in the end, it became this kind of saving grace, and also it allowed me to reconnect with certain parts of my creativity that I hadn't for a while, and that kind of stuff was really generative, I suppose. Being invited by happenstance to ask certain questions, deep questions about life and its shape was really useful to creativity, I found.
Great. So have you found that it's are you operating in a different way? Are you using completely different mediums than you would, or have you just rekindled ones that you've not used for a long time?
I started to go more into free verse with this particular collection, which was, I think, partly to do with just engaging with the idea of brevity in poetic form. Just having like little bursts of energy which I could use for creativity was pushing me towards that form in some ways. So I think maybe I have started to explore free verse prosody a bit more. And also maybe certain kinds of narrative poetry as well that I haven't been doing for a while, but maybe something like there's a poem called Nyami Nyami in the book, which was a commissioned poem a while ago, but that spurred me on to do some other narrative pieces as well for the book. So I think those things have, the situation that we're in has informed the things I've been doing creatively. And this book, lots of it was worked on during the very first lockdown. Maybe a third of it or half of it, I reckon. So I'm loath to think about being productive in the same ways I used to.
Yeah.
And I think about it more in terms of just kind of like living an integrated life now. And for me, living an integrated life includes creativity, whether I publish and show that work or not. So it's been nice to be creative for myself and not for an audience at certain points as well.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to say, does that mean that you've been creative for creative's sake a lot of the time? I think that's really good, that especially as an outlet, I think if it's just for yourself, it can often be a lot easier to let loose with the process as well.
Yeah, there's a different relationship you have to, I guess, things like authenticity, truth, vulnerability, if the audience is yourself.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I was just wondering what if anything this might have taught us in a positive way in terms of accessibility. I know that things like, I know that in the academy a lot of the discussion has been about conferences, and a lot of the disabled community saying suddenly, because able-bodied people weren't allowed to attend, suddenly it was super easy to make it accessible. So I know that there's a lot of that potentially we could bring forward, but in terms of art and poetry especially, which I think often gets a bad rap for being a bit of an exclusive world or an exclusive process, what might lockdown and sort of the new ways of sharing that teach us about it going forward?
I think the first thing you mentioned feeds into what I'm going to go on to say, and I think it's really important that this particular moment has shown us the ways in which society at large has been failing people with various disabilities or access requirements, which, if those requirements were met, they would be able to interact more thoroughly with art and creativity. And I think it really puts the onus on producers and people who are programming and everyone who's thinking about making work, really. Who is that work for? How are we thinking about audience? Who are we including in that as well? And I think that then feeds into an idea about what you're making the work for and for whom as well. Who you're trying to reach and what efforts you're making to reach people, whether you're being passive in that process or whether you're being more active and engaged in that process. And I think for me it's been an opportunity to think about the kinds of community engagement that I could be more involved in, the acts of solidarity as well in relation to poets working on collections or at an earlier stage in their career, for want of a better word, who are seeking for certain kinds of advice or kinship, which aren't available unless you go through formal structures. And I'm thinking about how we create informal structures with things like, we've realized now the ease of meeting with people across different constituencies. So what are we going to do with that? Are we just going to fall back into our smaller communities, or can we do something with that sense of connection that we've been shown that it's possible to do all sorts of things, and to feel that particular activity is still connected and communal, even though we're in these online rectangles. So I think, there's something for poets to think about in relation to that. Who are we doing it for, and how are we actively engaging in reaching people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said about that reaching out or establishing a sort of broader network. I think that undulation between the personal or even the microscopic and a reaching out is something that I wanted to discuss a little bit later with the collection, because I think that's something that really comes through in the way that poetry is written. So before we move on and ask you some more questions about the actual work, you've agreed to do a little reading for us. So if you want to just say a little bit about the collection, what you were aiming to do with it, and if you'd like to read something for us.
Sure. A Blood Condition as a collection kind of came together over the past 4 or 5 years, I suppose. Its first inklings came to me in the summer of 2017. So a little bit after Kumukanda came out, my previous collection, I was kind of experiencing the usual kind of feeling of a lull or fallow period where I was kind of exploring new ideas and thinking about what my forthcoming work would be like. And in the midst of this feeling, there came this kind of burst of new work. 3 or I think maybe even 5 poems that ended up in this book came in that summer in different forms, and they were worked on successively, but essentially their kind of spirit came across. And for me, when I'm working on a book, like, I have to figure out what the spirit of the book is. And something that came across to me at that early stage was that the spirit of this project was to try and let go of some of the narratives that feed into the first collection. Both of the collections are about, I suppose, grieving and coming to terms with one's life, I suppose. I think this second collection deals more explicitly with the idea of having moved through a process of bereavement, which is a long, complicated process, finding a new way to live without those people one is grieving. I think that's part of what this book is trying to do, is let go, I suppose, of some of the pain that's in the first book. And it's, I suppose, for me, part of a longer process in my work of finding new directions and perspectives on the same material. And once I feel I've kind of moved through that material, moving on to new material and trying to figure out what that is. So I think this is a book of transition between two states, both of being and of creativity, I guess. That's kind of what the idea was, or the feel or the spirit was behind this book. And I'm going to read 3 poems from it, or 3 or 4 poems, depending on how long they are. I'll start with this one, which is an attempt to bring the poetics of rap prosody into the space of published poetry a little bit. It's called 16 Bars for the Bits. Bars being the name that you give to a single line in rap, because it usually fits within a bar of music, and then the bits being the area, the neighborhood. 16 bars for the bits. The old men who meet at the same time each evening. The youngers get bladdered and staggered, the heaving, the chatter of pigeons emboldened while feeding, and towers that balance at heights beyond reason. A beacon for dreamers and schemers and heathens, you can find angels behaving like demons in ends where the rents seem to change with the seasons, and murder rates rise when the temperature's peaking. Friends changing tack interrupted while speaking, students in packs only back for the weekend, the steadfast who waited and think about leaving, the homeless in parks making bargains with breathing. The lights in the dark guide you home, and you're sleeping or tossing and turning or scratching and wheezing or thinking all night through the secrets you're keeping. And all this can come in the space of an evening. I was thinking in that poem about the kind of relationship of the 16-bar verse in rap to the sonnet, I guess. Both of them being kind of standard benchmarks of technical accomplishment, I guess. You know, they're the shape that you're supposed to be able to occupy. And so I might read this poem, which is exploring the thread that I mentioned about letting go. It's a poem called Longing, which is thinking about religious belief, faith, and yeah. And it's also an elegy for my mother. Longing. Towards the end, when she drifted beyond the reach of human medicine, my mother assembled a necklace of denominations: Pentecostal, Roman Catholic, Seventh-day Adventist, Anglican, and the African Church that met in a school of which my mother, myself, and the pastor were the entire congregation. From this 6-month I remember best a Christian Science reading room in Richmond, Mum leafing through a copy of the Monitor, placing her faith in words lifted to the frequency of longing, a pitch so lofty only a celestial ear could bend to it. And if the ear belonged to a person or persons outside time, that being, those beings, might grant divine providence. Give my mother a sign. Since I find myself in the Skyrack Wapentake in the West Riding of Yorkshire, I'll read some Yorkshire poems now. I had a relationship to Yorkshire already, which is that I studied for my first degree in Sheffield and had this, I guess, sense of Yorkshire from that. But living here has been a different experience after so much time. I spent quite a long time, 10 years, living back in London after I finished university. So living back in Yorkshire has been an interesting process of negotiating its rhythms, its language, and these are poems celebrating that. So I'll read 2 Yorkshire dialect poems, and then I'll finish with a sonnet, a Meredithian sonnet, which is in homage to Tony Harrison, who's a master of the Meredithian sonnet. So this is called Ginnell, and Ginnell is, of course, the Leeds or West Yorkshire way of saying a alleyway, a kind of space between 2 buildings, usually between a terrace. There are lots of words for that across the span of the British Isles and beyond. But Ginnell is what it's called round here. An interstice, a quarter tone, last known whereabouts of missing persons the world over. From the Old English, the coast's open moor, pointing the way to the Whale Road, gap in the teeth of a terraced street. And one thing that I really enjoyed about Yorkshire dialect speech is the abundance of the word love, which I found really moving. It's kind of like the overabundance of the word pet as an endearment in the Northeast, I guess, and that's how I saw it, because I used to live in the Northeast very early in my life, and I hadn't found in London the same kind of word, although I do enjoy London's endearments, like bruv, I guess, is a good one. I really enjoy that. So I was thinking about the endearments in Yorkshire, and love was one of them. It always came up, and this is the poem that I wrote in response to that. Hang around. This town will mind you of how little you need to speak and find an echo. Breathe good air amid mid-afternoon's demands. As a water droplet falls from spring leaves, indiscriminate endearment, fleck of grace, it lands. I see you. And I'll finish with this, which is a poem for Tony Harrison, whose work I was first introduced to as a student in Sheffield by a really enterprising and wonderful teacher called Neil Roberts, who's a wonderful scholar of poetry and, I suspect, a poet as well, although I've never seen any of his work, but I just have a feeling. We had a module in contemporary poetry which featured people like Tony Harrison, Peter Redgrove, etc., which kind of just gave me a perspective on post-war British poetry that I didn't have before. And we looked at some of the sonnets in the School of Eloquence, which is a sequence of Meredithian sonnets that Tony Harrison wrote about being from a working class background in Leeds, going to a grammar school and being gradually pushed by education away from that working class background. It's a really painful, arresting sequence. And having moved to Leeds, I was commissioned to respond to Tony Harrison's poem V. And this is my response, which is a postcard from the Shoalbrooks, which is a neighbourhood in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, which you'll have seen in kind of grainy images from the 70s. If you've been watching the recent documentary about the women who died at the hands of Sutcliffe. And I mentioned Sutcliffe in this poem, but I'm talking about Sutcliffe and Sons, the furniture makers from Todmorden, just to clarify. Postcard from the Shoalbrooks for Tony Harrison. Ciroc bottles and nitrous canisters. Far cry from dance floors and nightclub banisters, the youngers sing blessings on blessings on blessings. Pouring a sip for departed brethrens, lost to the brief imposition of blades, or jailhouse, or another city's grey skyline. Better because of its distance. Hitting the books, or freestyling fictions to big up their chests, they ride for their ends on quad bikes and push bikes, this circle of friends. In this corner of your corner of the world, Tony, that scrap of contested land curled in your books. Facing the street's chiaroscuro, I look on, lost in this writing bureau, 50-year emblem from Sutcliffe and Son, late thread in the fabric of Todmorden. So I thank you for listening, and thank you, Jessie, once again for inviting me to be in this space, and look forward to discussing.
Yeah, that was great. And you actually you picked a couple of my favorites, which is good. Yeah, I think you also touched a little bit in what you said about each of those on some of the things that I wanted to ask you about. Particularly, so full disclosure for listeners, I've actually met Kayo before. I was at Durham at the same time and was in your lecture about Claudia Rankin and the lecture about grime as well. So one of the main things that I was interested in talking to you about is what you said about bars and like the rhythms of rap and grime, and how you see that weaving into the other poetic traditions that you engage with. Is that sort of part of that extension that you were talking about before, extending the poetic worlds that you engage with?
Yeah, I think I came to writing the kind of poetry I write now sort of by accident. Um, but the main thing that led me here is that I was always interested in the music in language. Um, and so from a really early age, I was fascinated to memorize the lyrics to songs that I liked and to really just be accompanied by these words that I'd memorize and carry around with me and recite and this kind of stuff. So I was very taken by the relationship between music and literature from a really early age, through the kind of lyricism of Bob Marley. That was a big touchstone in my early childhood. Um, so when I came to being interested in writing, which is kind of from the age of 10 onwards, I would always be writing these little stories and things like that. It was a period of activity in UK music. Um, there was a lot of activity in UK garage because this was the late 90s, early 2000s. Then there was a kind of resurgence in UK hip hop as well. And there was also US hip hop, which was filtering through to me through my cousins and through my own listening. And then grime as well. So there were a number of different poetic traditions, I guess, within music in the UK that I was exposed to. And when I came to study poetry formally in school, um, for me there wasn't really a separation between those poetic traditions and the things we were looking at. In part, I think because the teachers I had always took pains to try and get us to think about the stuff we were listening to or interested in through that lens of kind of poetic practice. Um, and I have to send a shout out to Mr. Williamson, my who was the head of English at a school that I went to, who would begin all of his lessons on poetry by saying, "Good afternoon, poetry fans," which I really enjoyed as an approach to literary studies. Just like we're beginning with passion, we're beginning with fandom, we're beginning with interest first. So my interest in those different poetic traditions comes from fandom to begin with, comes from the kind of aesthetic jealousy, which is just like, how did that person do that?
Yeah,
Like, how is that possible? How can it be done? Um, and as I studied poetry formally in school, I felt that equally for poems printed on the page, as well as those sung or chanted or rapped in the air. Um, and as I was developing my own kind of taste and interest in poetry, it made sense that the two things would keep being in friction, coming together, and be in some kind of relationship with each other. Um, and for me, ultimately, both forms, although they're different, are about trying to balance sonic and referential meaning. Um, by which I mean, I suppose, trying to get across something on two levels: the level of A to B information transfer, where you're conveying something to someone, but also that kind of more instinctive, embodied transfer of information that comes from being bodies in space and sharing sonic uh, information and, the actual physical vibration which brings that sonic information about, which, even if it cannot be perceived at the level of auditory sensation, can be perceived in the body. Um, there's like there's a theory of poetry which I really love, which is that it's a kind of one of the technologies of breath. It's really connected to breath. And for me, it's connected to breath and also sound, our capacity to make sound, or to take taken even further, our capacity to imagine sound as well. Um, our capacity to encode sound in our brains, I think, is what interests me in poetry. So yeah, I was always going to be drawn to musical forms that play with that, and that's led me to the kind of hybrid mode that I'm increasingly moving towards.
yeah. I mean, I think that really does come across, um, with you know, especially the more rhythmic pieces where, you know, what you said about being drawn to the musicality of language, in, you know, the people that do that, how did they do that thing to me, where the voice, whether it's in rap or whether it's in spoken word, or even if it's on the page and you get a sense for it, where the language sort of becomes another instrument in the process. So yeah, before we delve into like the details of some of the specifics of the poems, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the cover art, because I know that was something that you mentioned in relation to Claudia Rankin, when I was in Durham. So I know that, I mean, if it even was you that chose it, I know that it will have been a decision with the publishers, but if you could just speak a little bit about that.
I did choose it. I choose all my covers to a greater or a lesser extent. I think that's the doorbell, but hopefully that didn't come across too much. But at the same time, I think the illusion of perfection is an unfortunate symptom of recording videos in this way. So, you know,
well, or it might add to the conversation, the imposition of external sound.
I'm living a dynamic, sonically engaged life.
Yeah.
So Toyin Oji Odutola is an artist whose work has struck me for a long time because of the ways that skin is depicted. You can see here the skin is rendered in this kind of polyvalent, multiply reflecting form. You can see I'm not an art critic, but a friend of mine who is a poet and playwright and visual artist introduced me to Toyin Oji Odutola's work maybe 10 years ago. And I've always just been really moved by the way that she, or I think they actually, my apologies, the way that they render black skin. And I'm really moved by seeing seeing a skin color which has been denigrated, I suppose, in dominant culture, be presented through the visual medium, using tropes of Western art and subverting those through this presentation of the skin. I'm really moved by that, and the same thinking went into my choosing an image from Lynette Yidim Boyachi for my first collection. And I think it's something I'll continue in some way, some relationship to visual art, because visual art is a really apposite touchstone for me in relation to the making of poetry. So when I was thinking about what might go on the cover, I was thinking about Toyin Oji Odutola, and when I saw this image, this was the image. I thought, this is the book. I'm really glad that Jack Shainman Gallery and Toyin agreed with that perspective, because I sent them my reasons, my rationale behind my thinking, because I think, there is a fricative relationship between visual art and publishing and poetry and literature sometimes, whereby images from visual art are used to illustrate the cover of a book. And I was trying to do something more dynamic. I was trying to have the image be front and center and have its own life and sit in dynamic relationship to the poems. And I think we managed it, Obviously it has my name and the title of the book, but at the same time, I think of this as a kind of, I think of this cover as bringing those things into relationship with each other in this context, but the image stands alone, and I hope that comes across. So yeah, it it was something that I saw and immediately something clicked, and I thought, yes, this is it.
Great. And what you said about that, the relationship between visual art and it being a bit of a touchstone for you, how does that come into, how much does that come into your writing in terms of being conscious of how it's actually going to look on the page, especially like, is that something that comes simultaneously with the sonic element of it, or is it something that you deal with after? Or
I think it's a simultaneous process for me with the kind of sound of the poem, because when I'm working on a poem, the length of the lines dictates some aspect of the sound, and there's a kind of instinctive feel for when the line, has come to a close. I don't know how else I can describe it, but it's kind of episodic for me. I usually write episodically, but sometimes I'll draft an entire poem at once. But even then, it's a kind of process of finding the first line and then finding a line that follows from that and continuing in that vein. So the visual and the auditory are very connected for me. And I do feel a kind of dissatisfaction with a poem when I look at it, something feels amiss and I can't quite put my finger on what that is. So I will edit for the kind of visual aesthetics of a piece as well as its sound. But for me, at least, I think sound is probably the prominent factor in my editorial and creative process. But definitely how it looks on the page is a consideration. And I guess another thing is that lots of us who write in various forms are writing in a kind of word processing package of some kind. We're not writing with this shape of thing in mind, and so you have to navigate that as well. How can I get this writing from another format to fit into this format? And these kind of things are, I think, really important, and they bring out some creative processes. When you're solving problems, you have to be really creative, and one problem you have to solve when making books is this was
fitting
made
it
in a
into a
different
book.
size.
Yeah.
How do we do that? So
Yeah.
it's a big part of my thinking, I think, to look at the visual side of the whole thing, the fact of making an object if I'm publishing work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that can be, I mean, more often than not, I think if I'm stuck writing, that's when I'll reach for more rigid form structures. I think it's a sort of, it's a bigger version of that, being that if you often the more limits you put on yourself, the more of a spark it can be for pushing yourself. So kind of related to that in terms of how it's laid out on the page and form. Something that I really love about the early section of the collection, everything between origin, myth, and forgive, where each piece's last line begins the next. And the fact that starts with origin myth, which is, about various different spreadings, and it feels as though each poem kind of, seeps into the next, and there's this linearity to them, which made me think a lot about queer time. Obviously, the blood condition's never explicitly named, and I'm not gonna name it for you, but obviously there's an imbrication between different communities when it comes to discussing that. And in terms of queer time, I know that a lot of people have spoken about, the lost generation to HIV being an interruption to time, and so a sort of straightforward linear timeline is not really appropriate for thinking in a queer inheritance way. Is that something that you were conscious of when you were writing and you wanted to reflect? How do you see the sort of overlapping of a queer or a racial perspective on time overlapping in the collection?
I think there is, yeah, lots of my engagement with these issues has been through the lens of HIV because of having been born in and grown up in, well, not grown up in, but having been born in and lived for some time in Zambia and having a family inheritance there. There's a very clear connection to the virus because it's very prevalent. In some areas, there's a kind of adult infection rate of 25% or so. There's 1 million plus orphans of HIV as well. And so I'm part of that legacy, both in a general sense and also in the specifics of my own life. And I was thinking about, I suppose you could think of a kind of different levels of legibility, I guess. I think queer peoples have not been legible in society for the longest time and continue not to be so. And especially in relation to this idea of a lost generation, of potential, of ideas, of genius, effectively. I do not think that a lot of people consider the grief of living with that inheritance, and having to negotiate that inheritance as part of one's coming out or being in the world as one feels most oneself. I don't think a lot of people really understand that. And I felt tremendous solidarity with that as someone who's Zambian and who has a similar relationship to generational loss, a kind of general loss and a specific loss as well. And the ways in which this virus has touched so many lives really struck me. But I had to honor the kind of queer lineage of the things that I've inherited as cultural forms. And that fed into my thinking about HIV too. The things I've inherited as cultural forms, DJing, hip-hop, house music, garage, all of them are shot through with a tremendous amount of queer ingenuity in lots of places. And so it felt important to honor that in a sequence like Origin Myth. And so we have the figure of Miguel, who's a DJ trying to reckon with the generational loss he experienced as a result of HIV, just as the speaker of the poem, or I guess the implied speaker of the poem, negotiates a kind of family history with HIV also, which is something I've been trying to do more directly, because it is a matter of personal resonance as well as generational and wider resonance for me. And I would like it to be a matter of wider resonance for the world, both in their understanding of the experiences, struggles, and oppressions that queer people have faced, and also of their understanding of the global South and how prevalent that particular virus is in those regions where hegemonic capital is lacking, and therefore the kinds of care that people need are also lacking. I think that's the area of solidarity around queer and racialized bodies in the book, I suppose. What have been the kind of systems of lack which have led to a widespread disenfranchisement, I guess, is not too strong a term to use. So yeah, I am and I was thinking consciously about those things. And I'm conscious also that I do not know directly the experience of queerness and the oppressions that come from that. However, I try to exist in solidarity with, and yeah, in sympathy and empathy with also, and that's what the poem is trying to do. And I don't think of it as like a finished project either. I think it's something to keep working on, because I will have got things wrong, and I will have, and all of us, I think, could be more communally engaged.
Yeah, I mean,
than
hopefully,
we are.
yeah, hopefully that. I mean, what you were saying before about, the establishing broader networks and being conscious, especially as creators, but as consumers of art in its various forms. Who that's for and who you're writing for.
What the roots of it are. Who was the whose creativity went into it, and therefore what violences you're doing if you erase that creativity and its impact and influence. Yeah.
Or I mean, and also who you can even tacitly highlight by engaging in those conversations. I think again that idea of queer time being one of artistic inheritance, if not familial.
Yeah.
That even if you're at the edges of that conversation maybe, but where there's some overlap, I think that just by engaging with those issues and artistically engaging with them specifically really helps to modify that in some ways.
Yeah, I think challenging orthodoxies about what it has to be like to be in the world is one of the most important things that you can do as an artist. And I say you can do, you don't have to, but for me it's crucial. Because otherwise my passion for it becomes lost in technique, which is fine. Technique is brilliant, wonderful, but without that social engagement, my heart's not in it, I don't think. And that's what I'm trying more and more to cultivate in my work.
Great. So I mean, I wanted to finally really just ask you about some of your other roles. If you could just speak a little bit about the White Review, but the Complete Works program as well. Like if you could talk a little bit about that, about what the aims are there, how it's affected your own practice, etc.
Yes, I'm the departing poetry editor at the White Review. I won't be editing poetry there, but I have been for about just over 3 years now, I believe. And I've been really struck by the interplay of different constituencies, I guess, for want of a better word. There's kind of like people who are visual artists and kind of led by that, who are interested in the magazine. Plus there's also kind of people led by text, and there's also people in between who are in a kind of hybrid space. And what I really enjoyed about interacting with it is that it kind of expands my horizons as a writer to engage with different art forms. And I also like that it's also a lot about conversation, about people gathering together. There's like the round tables and interviews and things like that. And I think the more conversation we can open up around art, the more accessible it becomes to somebody who doesn't move through the formalized structures of arts education which currently exist and which are very exclusive. That's not to say that something like a magazine which you have to subscribe to isn't exclusive in its own way, but I think the things around something like a magazine, like an event, a reading, something that people can go to, I think that opens up a space which is powerful. And I guess the particular thing that I've been struck by in working with the White Review is serving as a judge for its Poets Prize, which has really, I think of myself as someone who's engaged in the poetry community and finding out what's going on. And it has always, always, always introduced to me new work, which I haven't seen elsewhere. And I think that process is crucial to the health of any art form. That it's continuously accepting new people into the fold and making them part of the community rather than siphoning them off into sub communities. I feel like they should be part of the whole thing. So yeah, it's been a real joy to work on it, really. And to engage with art in its wider sense. And really the complete works is, I think, something I'm really proud to have been part of, in the sense that it formalizes or makes explicit a legacy and family tree that existed in British poetry for a long time. And it extends the scope of that family tree, because through things like the publications that come from such an initiative, more people are emboldened to do to make things, to create poetry and be part of the poetry community, and to feel themselves acceptable to the poetry community as well. When I think about poets like Roger Robinson, Malika Booker, Jacob Samler-Rose, Dorothea Smart, all of them gave me permission to do what it is that I do. So as impressed or moved or whatever else as someone might be by my work, the work exists in relationship to a whole family of works. And something like that initiative, The Complete Works, really just opens that up and says, this is the lineage, these are some tributaries of the lineage. These people weren't even included in the official scheme, but they're active as well, and we're going to bring them in as well, and we're going to bring in this as well. And I'm really grateful for the efforts of Bernardine Evaristo and Danusha Keane and Natalie Teitler for starting up that initiative. And most especially Bernardine for her advocacy and activism, and Natalie for having such boundless energy to launch new initiatives. At the moment, she is working on a cross-platform cross-fertilization between Latinx poets in diaspora and in Central and South and North America and around the world with Black British poets. And that collective, I think, is called The Bridge. They do lots of readings and stuff like that, and I'm really excited to see what those kinds of cross-pollinations yield in terms of lots of different kind of initiatives and groups and collectives, formal and otherwise. I would love for them to come together every year and have a little AGM and decide what we're going to do next. But yeah, it's a really powerful cohort to have been part of, and I'm really honored, really, that I was chosen for it. But also, I'm enlivened by the fact that it has emboldened other poets as well, and I hope they embolden further poets, and it just continues from there.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that's that network that we were talking about, and like things that are made more available and more open by things like digital events. You know, I think that you're right that non-academic spaces, whatever they be, aren't necessarily by their nature more open to a wider group of people, but that, you know, the things around them, like the events and readings and things like that, can be and have only become more accessible when they've not been, you know, when they've been online instead of in person. You said then a little bit that, which was something that I wanted to touch on, just that you've been surprised and like delightfully surprised every time when you've read stuff for the White Review, when you've had submissions for the competition. Do you have quite a rigid idea of what you like to read in terms of poetry, and what you expect to see, or is that exciting because you're up for reading?
I guess I have I've had a variety of rigid ideas about what my benchmark of excellence is, and they've collected together to be comparatively broad, I guess. So I've been through a number of different phases where I'm only enjoying this or I'm only enjoying that. And now I think what I really enjoy is that kind of embodied, sonically engaged work, which kind of makes me feel alive, for want of a better word. And what I mean by that is I guess it doesn't leave out that messy aspect of the human condition, of human existence. And the poem feels like a living thing in the sense that perhaps it might not necessarily be edited technically the best that it could be, or it might have all sorts of inconsistencies, but there's a kind of spirit there. A spirit of kind of like passion or connection or something that somebody, a human being, was exploring. So I think that's what I'm looking for. And if I can't immediately detect that, I'm also willing to go back to the work and read it again and again to find different resonances in it. I guess the only thing that I'm not into in terms of reading poetry is, I guess, where something is technically good only.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful and really enjoyable. But, you know, I will. Yeah, I'm really struck by. I'm really struck by when something is not technically good, but its spirit is overwhelming.
Yeah, if it's got a soul to it.
Yeah, that's basically it. So I have my like old favorites.
Yeah.
But in terms of stuff that I'm reading that's fresh, there's always that. Yeah, does this move me at that basic human level of this was a person who felt something and felt moved to capture that something, whatever it is, even if I don't know what the something is. I don't always care if it's clear or not, but just that there's something is I think what drives my reading process. Yeah, and you know, it will probably it will change, and I go through different phases at some point. But I think it's important to change your outlook every now and again, and
I think I mean, I think, you know, obviously this is kind of our whole thing, is the overlap between activism and art. But yeah, I think that's a really straightforward way of establishing the soul of a piece, is if it's got some righteous anger, or even if it's just directed towards some change through, you know, whatever means that is. But if it's trying to do some good, I think that kind of immediately establishes a soul in it a lot of the time.
Yeah, if the poem engages with some, I guess some kind of transformative power in language or in words, or
Mm-hmm.
I guess engages with the fact that we created this technology in order to do certain things. Yeah, and to do, good, social good. So, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that's potentially something that I've come back to in my own reading, that, that going back to the very stripped down principles of, why do people write? It's a form of communication. And looking at poetry as just that, as like, okay, this is just a different form of very deep and meaningful communication.
Yeah, I wish all my poems were deep and meaningful, but some of them
I think
are really
you pulled it
frivolous.
off in the collection as a whole.
Yeah, I think, I'm
I
happy
think they're all
with
deep and meaningful anyway.
I'm happy with the level of kind of depth that I was able to reach with this particular work. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do occasionally write poems in the voice of like a video game character or something fanciful like that. But
I mean,
yeah,
there's deep meaning to be drawn from play as well.
that is true. That is true. That's a good point. That's a good point.
So yeah, I mean, I think we'll start wrapping up. But before we go, have you got any reading or listening recommendations for people before you go?
Yeah, so many. I'm even sat by my desk, which is useful. Yeah, this is called The Winged Seed by Lee Young Lee. Wonderful. It's called a remembrance, but it's really like a poem in prose or a lyric essay, which stretches over many pages, but it's really beautiful. This is one of my favorite all-time poetry books, which is Mandelstam's selected poems, but specifically the Clarence Brown and M.S. Merwin translation. This memoir is really good, by Michelle T, which is against memoir, and the title just captured my heart because it was, oppositional. In terms of, I've been reading a lot of books about narrative craft because I'm working on a memoir. I really like this one, which is called...
Great cover.
Yeah, Meander, Spiral, Explode, Design and Pattern in Narrative by Jane Allison. And then the G of G's, Ursula Le Guin, Steering the Craft, which is, like,
That's quite a few people's go-to craft book.
Yeah, it's like being, taught by a grandmaster in narrative craft to read that book. So, all of those have been really, really helpful to my process. Plus, I'm also really enjoying audiobooks right now. And in particular, is it Emily Wilson? Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. Yeah. I've been listening to the audiobook of that, which is read by Claire Danes, I think, who plays Carrie Matheson in Homeland, which is a show that I have enjoyed, even as it's very problematic.
Yeah.
But there's something interesting about hearing the poem through such a familiar voice, which has really like opened up this kind of long form narrative for me.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm going to let you go, but so thank you so much, Kayo, for joining us and talking to us. And so how can people check out your further work? Just lastly.
If you like the kind of auditory side of things, then a good place to go is YouTube. Some of my readings are collected there. Granta are running a one of the poems from the collection called Genealogy on their website, so you can go and check that out there. Various places. If you want to hear me talk about like poetry and stuff, then there's like some interviews in the public domain as well, in text and audio as well. The British Library did one, which you can listen to if you like going into the stacks. Yeah, lots of different ways. You can also just go to my website as well, which I don't update as often as I should, but you can get an overview there.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So thanks so much again. Thanks everyone for watching. From our point of view, if you're interested in pitching an article to us, you can either contact us at info@radicalartreview.org, or if you want to pitch a literature piece to me personally, you can send it to Jessie, JSSIEFLO Jones@gmail.com. So on Twitter, we're Rad Art Review, and on Instagram, we're Radical Art Review. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening, and thanks, Kayo, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, no worries. Thanks very much. Bye.
No worries.